Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here today, as we generally do, with our large damp square-headed brush and some titanium white paint. I'm applying this to the horizon of the sky and then blending upwards. From there, I'm going to go back to my palette, grab a mixture of a good amount of titanium white, a little bit of primary blue, apply that on top of our initial application, and blend it downwards. From there, I'm going back to the palette, this time grabbing another mixture with a little bit of additional primary blue, applying that to the top of the canvas, and yet again blending it all together until we get something quite smooth. Now, the trick to rendering a very subtle transition and gradient, one without brush strokes or implications, is generally to use a very soft touch of the brush. When you apply a great deal of pressure, you can create a lot of implications and markings. The bristles can kind of leaf off and kind of present areas that have a lot more paint. But if you want it to be very subtle, just use a very small amount of pressure on your brush and you should do great. From there, jumping into the water, at the back I used a fairly desaturated blue, and then as we moved forward into the foreground, I began to interject slightly more color and make it slightly brighter. So I'm slowly adding more primary blue and titanium white to that mixture. In the very back there is a small amount of Mars black, and it dissipates as we move forward. That way we get a gradient from darker to lighter, but it also goes from desaturated to saturated. Generally, when you're painting a landscape, you want to make the background slightly more desaturated, make the foreground more saturated, that way it pops and it stands out. It feels like you're much more close to it. And you can do that even in seascapes as well. It doesn't just apply to land and mountains and fields. So when you're painting something like this, keep in mind that the background of your seascape will generally be benefited by incorporating less saturated pigments. Now here I'm incorporating some waves. I've switched over to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm using this because it can hold a good amount of paint, but it also has that nice fine sharp edge for delivering these crisp waves. Now I'm applying them initially with a sharp application, then I blend the back of them into the back of the painting, slowly letting it dissipate. This is going to make it look like the wave is rising up out of the water, and it has this nice crisp clean edge created by that small square-headed brush. Also worth noting, we did the background and the initial layer of water with the larger square-headed brush because it does have that sharp edge, which is great for defining the horizon line, but it can also carry a good amount of pigment as well. So with that said, I'm not done the water, but I have the initial strokes down. I'm fairly happy with them. We're going to let that dry. And also, for the record, if you're applying all of those smaller white strands, those pieces of water that are protruding and creating waves, and the underlayer is starting to get a little bit dry, and when you're doing the application, it's a little bit chalky. You get a little bit more of that tooth of the canvas. It's not going on smooth. Just apply a little bit of additional water to your brush, and you should be in a fairly good position. It'll glide much more smoothly on the canvas. You'll be able to move it farther than you would, and you'll also get a nice transparent effect, so you can move from that stark white at the front of the wave into the dissipating effect into the rest of the blue water. Now from there, I'm going into the foreground. I'm using a bit of a Mars black, a burnt umber, tiny bit of titanium white, and just creating essentially a silhouette first on the rocks. Then I'm going back to my palette. I'm creating a bit of a brighter burnt umber. This is more burnt umber, titanium white, little bit of Mars black, and I'm creating some highlights on the rock, as you can see, just in the areas that are going to catch a little bit of light. It's going to give it a little bit of dimension and depth in the foreground and make it look slightly more realistic. Now, once that's done, I'm going to take my medium-sized round-headed brush and begin to create some clouds in the background. I wanted to wait until the majority of the sky was dry to do this, just because when you go and you apply more paint, you apply that additional titanium white for the clouds while it's still wet. Sometimes it can become a little bit muddy, you can get a little bit too much paint on there and you don't get that nice subtlety that you would if you were to let it dry. So here, I did let it dry. I moved back in with the round-headed brush, and I'm applying this titanium white pigment with a lot of water, so it's fairly transparent, and I'm moving my brush in circular strokes so that both the top and the bottom of the cloud are fairly feathered, and you get that gradient from that more opaque pigment to the more clear pigment on the very edges. It's just good to add a little bit of extra depth in your clouds. You can allocate different areas to be more brought out, more opaque, and some to be a little bit more subtle as well. Now, from there, I'm going back into the water and I'm just applying some additional waves. Should be noted, when you're doing the waves like this, the ones very far away should be much smaller, much more thin, and then as they get closer to us, they get much larger, and you can have more of that pure titanium white. You want it to dissipate a little bit as you get into the background. Much like saturation, in the foreground of a painting, you want things to be very saturated, you want them to be very stark. You have your true whites, your pigments that are very dark. As you get towards the background of the painting, things should be much more muted, less saturated. You don't have pure whites, you don't have those pure dark colors. And it's another little tip that's really going to add a lot of depth into your painting, and again, even into your seascapes. I think a lot of people kind of, initially at least, think that those rules only apply to generic landscapes, but it does work here as well. Now, as you can see here, we're starting to work on the splashing effect. For this, I'm using an old square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a dabbing motion with it, you render just a litany of implications on the canvas. They're always different and evolving. It's great because it makes it look so much more real. You can also render these applications that are much smaller than you would have been able to with any other brush. It also saves a lot of time. If you don't have one of these brushes, you can make one very easily. You take a regular brush, you peel back the bristles till it looks inconsistent, then you do exactly what I'm doing here. And here I'm actually adding a little bit of texture. As you can see, I'm doing this application so it looks like the splashing is coming up. It's dissipating on the tops, it's much more thick on the bottom, doing more applications at the bottom, and I'm also adding a little bit of texture at the bottom for that extra pop in the foreground, just to ensure it really stands out and grabs the audience. I'm also applying portions of it around the rocks. It's kind of coming through the rocks in a couple of areas, and that's also just to add a little bit of depth. Now you can take that same brush, as you can see, and interject a couple of these applications back into the waves as well. This just makes it look a little bit more cohesive. It makes it make much more sense in the foreground what we're looking at in terms of the splashing water, and it's also just a fun pattern to work throughout your painting as well. You'll need to be much more delicate with that application, apply less pressure. You don't want it to be as stark, and you don't want as many splashing effects on those waves in the background, but it will certainly aid the painting as well. Now I'm also picking a couple of different areas in the splashes to be slightly more pronounced, so I'm letting this one lead up a little bit more. Then I'm grabbing my smaller round-headed brush, picking a couple of areas that I want to really be pronounced, and I'm applying those with that little tapping effect. Then I'm taking a little bit of blue and showing that the water's running through and around just a couple of the rocks as well. I'm using predominantly a horizontal stroke for this, so it looks like it's kind of crashing back and forth, but the round-headed brush is fantastic for this situation. You want to think about what brush you're using for each scenario. We use the square-headed brushes in the sky, on the waves, because they're sharp and they can hold a lot of paint. The round-headed brushes work because they have very feathered edges. They're very soft. They're great for rendering things that the edges are a little bit softer, like clouds, mist, or water as it moves through areas, because the edges aren't going to be as opaque. Now I'm going back yet again to the sky. I'm adding some additional highlights in the clouds, and this is something that I'm going to go back to a couple of times, just because you kind of get a new perspective as you let it dry. Acrylics innately dry a little bit more dark, and you can just get a better perspective if you do it in layers. It also gives you some time to think about it as well, which is great. Then I add a little bit of a mist or a diffusion to the background with that titanium white. I blended it out both up into the sky and down into the water. Again, it just helps with depth, and here I'm creating some additional clouds in the sky. That is essentially our 10-minute version, but as per usual, had a couple of additional little ideas and I wanted to share them with you. Here we're making the painting slightly more dynamic with these more linear clouds. By incorporating different types of clouds, you can really create a lot of interesting effects and visually guide the viewer with them. And I'm also adding a couple of little birds in the background with the small round-headed brush. This is going to ensure that the painting has a little bit of life and fun to it as well. And there we have it, our 10 to 12-ish minute painting. Truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a bunch of new content up on the website right now, link in the description. Over there I have my 2 books, Acrylics for Beginners Painting Prompts. They are on sale until March 31st. And Acrylics for Beginners, it's essentially everything you need to know to jump into your first painting. We talk about blending with water, what brushes to use, how to blend your paint, all of the essentials. Painting Prompts is essentially 21 digital sketches for days where you really want to paint, create, and get better at your craft, but you don't have an idea of what you want to do. Also up there, I just launched the premium 4-hour lessons. In it, you get to see my color palette when we're mixing with water, all that good stuff we don't have time for in this lesson. You can also get hour-long lessons up over on the Patreon. With that said, thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see you next Saturday with a new lesson, and as always, stay creative.